everyone and welcome back to my channel. As you can see, I've had my hair cut and the hairdresser, the sweet lady, decided to cut it a little bit too short for my taste. So normally I would wait a few days to film in order for it to grow back down, but I can't do that because I'm filming every single day. And here is Zeus as my co-star. As per usual, for today's video, I would like to highlight all of those wonderful books that I have read, but that I rarely talk about because they weren't perhaps quite 5-star reads for me, or they are books that I have gradually forgotten again, and it's hard for me to give you a detailed synopsis, and for that reason, I sometimes push them back and don't talk about them in my videos. But that's not going to happen today. Today's video is all about those books that I consider honorable mentions, which means books that weren't quite my favorites that I keep talking about on this channel, but that are still up there and that I remember loving when I read them, even though I might not remember them 100% today. As you can see, I have a stack behind me. I had a lot of fun scanning my shelves and finding those books, and it turned out I found about 15 of them, so I better get started. On top we have my small paperbacks. First we have Neil Gaiman's Fragile Things. This is a short story compilation which I read back at university, and I believe this was my first book of Neil Gaiman's. What is peculiar about this short story collection is that it is told based on the frame of the months of the year. Imagine you are sitting at a big dining table and there are 12 people seated around the table. Each person corresponds to a month. The person called January obviously tells us a story based on January and so forth. I liked that idea, and I've only read this book once, so I can't tell you a single thing about any of these stories because I can't remember them, but I remember that I was fascinated with this concept, and it was a great introduction to Neil Gaiman because it made me read more by him in the upcoming years and really like those books. So definitely one I would consider an honorable mention. So this one is one I remember vividly because this is American Psycho by Bret, Easton, Ellis. I wouldn't say this is one of my favorite books simply because that would be too telling of me and my personality. This is a very scary read, one of the scariest reads I've ever read. I don't like to consider it a favorite because does that make me a psychopathic serial killer? I don't know. Anyway, I'm rambling. This is about a protagonist who is a serial killer, and he is remorseless. He goes out and connects with no one, but on the surface he seems to be this perfect, neat guy with a lot of money, with designer clothes and the perfect apartment, but on the inside he is dark. He turns around and he becomes this psychopath who tortures and kills people for no reason, basically. That's the basic premise, but I promise you this book comes with the most gruesome scenes I've ever read. And I've only read it once because that was enough, and I'm not sure it's one I ever want to reread, but it's definitely one that made an impact. And you know I love those gory, twisted stories, so I really liked it, but beware when you read this book. I've never actually watched the movie American Psycho. I have heard that the book is more detailed and vivid in its descriptions and in its scenes. Some of the brutal scenes have been cut in the movie, so I don't know why I haven't watched it. I think I'm still afraid to go back into that protagonist's mind. Next we have a book I read last summer, and that is On Beauty by Zadie Smith. And I was surprised to learn that while I was reading it, a lot of people commented that they hated this book. I mean, a lot of people said that, and I loved it. I was so impressed with it, even though it's not much of an impressive story. It's basically about this family, and we get to follow each of the individuals and how they function in this family, but we also hear about the family as a whole and how they live and how they think and speak, etc. It sounds very boring, but it's not. It's another one of those stories that is very much about the characters, as you can hear, and not a lot about the plot, and maybe that's what makes people dislike it. I don't know, but I know that this is my favorite I've read of Zadie Smith's so far. I think I've only read 2 of her novels. I liked how this was down to earth, easy to read, interesting to follow, and just an impressive read all in all. So I really liked it, but you might not. But that's the thing with books, ain't it? I'm getting hot in here. And it's not even noon, but it's still pretty hot and humid. Next book is Night Waking by Sarah Maas. I don't know why I don't talk more often about this book on this channel, because this was one of my favorites. I gave this one 5 stars. Once again, it's a very down-to-earth story about this family that is somewhat dysfunctional. I believe they live on an island, very isolated, and the mother has decided to give up on her career in order to stay at home and take care of their 3 children while her husband works. This book is very much about parenthood and how that can gradually drive you a little bit insane and make you wish for another life. But it's also about this interesting and peculiar skull that the daughter finds in the garden when she's digging a hole, and so it combines some kind of archaeology, is that what it's called, with just an everyday family trying to live and survive. I loved it. Sarah Maas is a phenomenal writer. I've read 2 of her books, this one and The Tidal Zone, and deeply loved both of them. But this one is the one I don't talk about too much for no reason. I don't know why, but it's one of my favorites and it's definitely an honorable mention. Oh yeah, next we've got Fingersmith by Sarah Waters, which I believe is the only Sarah Waters book that I completely fell in love with. I have my apprehension about her books in general, but this one was an attention keeper. I loved how it is sassy and it plays with your mind. You never really know how to conceive the protagonist and understand her, because she is a mind twist, and I love that. It's a historical fiction set in London in the 19th century. You shouldn't really know too much about this book going into it, just read it and there's a pretty good chance that you're going to love it. This is one of those books that I only hear great things about, and after having read it I can only agree. Then I have The Parranda by Joseph Boyden, and I believe he is Canadian. I'm pretty sure he is, and I'm pretty sure this book is set in Canada. So the interesting thing about this book is that it's one of the only books I've read set in the 17th century. So the story is based on a world 400 years from now. That's a lot, but still I was so emotionally invested in this book and in these characters. We basically follow people living and surviving in the wilderness of Canada. That's how they did 400 years ago. They didn't have houses, they didn't have large communities. So we get to follow these tribes and how they survive, which is obviously in nature, so it's going to be brutal. There are going to be sacrifices involved and animals and hunting and killings, and I really liked it for that, because I felt like it was honest to its history, and it taught me a lot about what it was like to live back then. I'm pretty sure this gives a correct depiction of that time, and also it taught me about Canada and the native people of that land. So this was definitely an educating read, one of those that I really loved, and once again one of those that I don't talk about enough on this channel, unfortunately. I'm not even halfway through the pile. Next we have The Crane's Dance by Mick. This one is about a couple of siblings who live and dance in New York. However, in the beginning of the book, they dance ballet, by the way. And in the beginning of the book, we hear about one of the sisters who has broken down mentally and has been sent back home. And the second sister is then left alone in New York City. She continues to dance, but it's also about how her sister's mental breakdown has affected her and how she keeps on going nevertheless, but it's very hard for her to focus on her dancing combined with what is going on in her family. It's another 5-star read for me. I love this book to pieces. I haven't since then read another book by Mick, but I'm definitely interested to do so at some point in the future. Then we have one of those books that I read some years ago and I can't remember the story, But I do remember that it was a favorite of mine when I read it, and I gave it 5 stars. I believe it was on my favorites list of that year. But sitting here now, I can't remember it, and maybe you know the feeling when you read a lot of books, some of the old stories you have read will be pushed back, and one day you will basically have forgotten about them. But I'm not going to let that prevent me from showing you this book today, because this is definitely an honorable mention, among others by Jo Walton. What I remember from this is that it's about a young girl who encounters magical spirits in some way. I believe it's fairies, and then it's also a coming-of-age story. But that's really all I remember. I just really loved it. I was impressed with it. And it was one of those books that I devoured, and afterwards I was impressed that I had loved it as much as I did, because normally I'm not much into fairies, but this one I was into. The same goes for the next book, which is another one I have partly forgotten, but I can tell you that it is Deathless by Catherine M. Valente, and it is based on Russian folklore. So it is a retelling of one of those ancient tellings. And it was a really good retelling. It's so unfortunate that I don't remember too much from it. Once again, I believe it's about a little girl who is growing up and encounters some magical creatures who are some kind of obstacles in her way, but she also encounters some helpers. So it's your basic fairy tale-esque retelling, and I believe that this was one of the better ones. So another one I gave 5 stars to, and I own it and I have kept it because I remember loving it. I just don't really remember much from the story anymore. Then we have Under the Udala Trees by Gennaro or Parranda. So this one is set in Nigeria or in another African country, but it is about our main character, who is a girl living with her mother, and her mother desperately wants for her daughter to find a husband so that she can establish a family and live happily ever after, as everyone else seems to do. But turns out this daughter is a lesbian, and she is fighting with herself and her emotions, trying to prevent them, but it's not happening. And naturally her mother is not happy about this. So this is another coming-of-age story about some internal emotional struggles that were not okay back when this story was set. Let me see. Okay, it is set in Nigeria, and I can't recall. I think it's during the Civil War. Anyway, it's some years ago that this was set, and back in those days it was not okay to not marry a man if you were a woman. This was a heartbreaking story, but also an important one that I really liked. It found its way into my heart, and I remember it fondly. You are getting a lot of different storylines in this video, so I hope there is something for you, whether you like fairy tale retellings or books set around the world, or maybe a very peculiar story like this one. This is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. So I actually have 2 books by Neil Gaiman on this list, but this has got to be my favorite of his, because this is a book basically about walking down memory lane and realizing that you have forgotten a lot of things from your childhood that you thought you remembered, but you clearly didn't. In this book we follow a man who returns to his childhood home, and this immediately sets off a lot of thoughts and feelings in him that bring him down memory lane. It's also got a magical twist to it, this book. And it's about impressions, very much about impressions and how you feel and experience things emotionally. It's a book I had to reread because the first time I read it, I wasn't sure I knew what it was really about. So I reread it, and then the second time around I was in love and gave it 5 stars. This is definitely my favorite book by Neil Gaiman, and I believe this is more of an adult novel. This is definitely a beautiful book, but it's one of the more peculiar ones, so just beware of that when you start reading. I have now made it down to the tall hardbacks, so here we have The One You Left Behind by Jojo Moyes. I generally like Jojo Moyes. I find that she writes beautiful and captivating love stories, and when I'm in the mood for those, Jojo Moyes never disappoints, and this one is, I think, my favorite of hers. This is the Danish cover, but as I said, it's called The One You Left Behind in English. And it's a story set in 2 time periods. One is from 100 years ago in France, and one is from today in England, I believe. The 2 stories and the 2 characters that we follow have some kind of a connection, which I'm not going to spoil for you, but they are connected and it's basically their story. Even though they are set 100 years apart, this is a love story, and it was one that touched me a lot. I loved reading this book, and it's definitely one of my favorites by Jojo Moyes. Next we have This Must Be the Place by Maggie O'Farrell. This is my first book by this very prolific author who has written a lot of books, I believe. But this is a fiction book set around the world. In the beginning of the book, I believe it's set in the UK. It's also set in America, and as far as I remember, we are also taken to Australia. But it's another one of those books that I don't remember vividly. Unfortunately, I do remember that I liked the characters a lot, and I liked being taken around the world and seeing all the connections between those settings. And I also felt like the story, which is about a movie star in some way, and also about this man who falls in love with her. But that's all I remember, and it's really aggravating me because it's not been more than a year since I read this. But I guess this is what happens when you read a lot, that you are never able to remember all stories vividly for years and years afterwards. And some books make more of an impression than others, but this one had to be on this list because even though I don't remember the story in details, I do remember loving this book and giving it 5 stars. We are down to the last 2 books. The next one is a very heavy hardback. This is The Revolution of Marina M by Janet Fitch. This is about the Russian Revolution in the beginning of the 1900s. We are taken through this revolution through our protagonist called Marina. She is a young girl when we meet her, but as she is growing up during the revolution, she is captivated by everything that's going on around her. She wants to participate, she wants to help, she wants to see things develop and change in a country. So it's a coming-of-age story, but it's a very brutal one because, as you can imagine, the revolution was not a very calm and peaceful one, that's for sure. I like this book. It took me on such a journey. It's an 800-page book and I read it over a month. And after having finished it, I felt like I had been through hell and back, kind of, but in a good way. And then I realized that this is just the first book in the series, apparently. But nevertheless, this book made an impression, and I gave this one 4 stars back in the days because I really liked it, and I liked how it taught me about this revolution. And then the last book I have to talk about today is a non-fiction one, and that is Steve Jobs' Biography. I know, if you're not an Apple fan, you might not be interested in this book, but I don't think you have to be an Apple fan. I think this book is more about the man Steve Jobs and how he grew up to invent these machines and basically revolutionize the technology of today. It's also about his partnership with his other co-worker, I can't remember his name, and it's also about his death and how he became even more and more ill while this book was written. And it also comes with some amazing photographs throughout of the first Mac computer, of his family and children, and of himself as he grew up and became one of the greatest men when it comes to technology. So this is a great biography, which, as you can see, it has some pretty amazing photographs. I believe this is the first Mac computer, and I really like this. So it's one that is stuck on my shelves. It can't be removed. I want to keep on to it forever, and I just really liked it, but don't talk too much about it on this channel for some reason. That is it for this long video in which I finally got to talk about some of those books that I don't talk about too much. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you got some kind of recommendations out of it. Thank you so much for watching, and until my next video, happy reading!